Unsurprisingly, in their conversations, Kissinger and Haig touched on the state of global politics. And at one point, Henry Kissinger wondered aloud what Sir Eyre Crowe would have done and what he would have advised. Now, much to Kissinger's surprise, neither Haig nor his advisors had any idea who or what Crowe might have been. Now, just in case your memory needs to be jogged ever so gently, Sir Eyre Crowe was a diplomat. Whose career straddled to the time of the First World War, and he ended up as permanent Under-Secretary. But he established for himself a very formidable reputation on account of his brilliant analyses of more especially Anglo-German relations before 1914. His memorandum of the 1st of January 1907 is something that we inflict on all our undergrads, and which really any budding international historian has to read. And it earned Crowe a very special place in Whitehall mythology. But Kissinger's question in 2011 seems even more pertinent now in the aftermath of last June's referendum. So what might Crowe, if he were with us today, have advised the present Foreign Secretary? I will leave aside here the most obvious point that he would have argued very strongly against the idea of taking the power of settling the country's future strategic direction out of the hands of politicians and expert officials and asking the uninitiated to make that decision. Once that decision was made, as any loyal civil servant, however, he would have turned his mind to the task ahead, and he would have given some thought to the future prospects of Britain outside the European Union. So allow me then to indulge in a little fantasy. Here is what I think Crowe might have said. Memorandum, secret. The referendum of the 23rd of June 2016 was the outcome of Britain's complex and often fraught relations with the European Union. The decision to end our membership of the EU means a sharp break with the essential continuity of British foreign policy. It is therefore necessary now to redefine its aims and objectives. 2. For the better part of 500 years, English and then British policy was guided by the principle of preventing the continent from uniting or being united at the exclusion of this country. Yet when the continental countries eventually took steps to unite, by peaceful means in the 1950s, Britain remained aloof. When she eventually did join, the structures of the now European Economic Community reflected carefully balanced compromises between its original founder members. The decision to join the EEC, despite all the Europhile rhetoric deployed by Mr. Heath at the time, was based on a policy of selective engagement, advocating political and economic cooperation whilst eschewing deeper integrationist schemes advocated at various times. Later prime ministers of different political stripes blew hot and cold on European cooperation, but there was a strong element of continuity in policy since 1973. In essence, all British governments since then ascribed to institutionalized Europe, as Mrs. Thatcher rightly put it, a wider strategic purpose, alongside NATO as a safeguard of freedom, prosperity, and stability in Europe. 3. Prosperity and security may thus be said to have been at the heart of Britain's European policy. Since the British economy grew during the 44 years of membership of the European Club by 103%, more than any other economy, more than the German at 96%, and significantly more than the French at 72%, it might be argued that that policy was successful in attaining its objects. However, Her Majesty's government have now decided to strike out in a new direction, and this requires a recalibrating of foreign policy. 4. I will leave aside here the vital and urgent need for the government to take sustained and systematic action to address the shortcomings in Britain's education system and the country's skills shortages. This will be for other departments of state to determine, but urgent action in this field is pressing, and it needs to form part of a coherent grand strategic design for Britain's future in the world. 5. As in earlier periods of our history, Britain's ability to attain her international ambitions, as I set out in my memorandum of January the 1st, 1907, is conditional on the national policy of Britain being so directed as to harmonize with the general desires and ideals of all mankind. Much has changed since that day. Our global political and military reach has contracted as our economic might diminished in the 20th century, but that general condition still applies. 6. The international system will be relatively stable if the level of reassurance required by its members is achievable. History shows that when diplomacy no longer functions properly, relations between states become more competitive and unstable. This needs to be borne in mind as Britain prepares to extract herself from the EU. 7. Terminating our membership of that body does not mean that Britain can turn away from Europe. The conditions of Britain's geographical situation on the ocean flank of Europe alone do not allow for this. The Prime Minister rightly asserted in her recent speech in Philadelphia that, and I quote, "We will build a new partnership with our friends in Europe. We are not turning our back on them or on the interests and the values that we share. It remains overwhelmingly in our interest and in those of the wider world that the EU should succeed. And for as long as we remain members, we will continue to play our full part, just as we will continue to cooperate on security, foreign policy, and trade once we leave." 8. A more assertive China, a Russia intent on probing Western weaknesses in pursuit of a policy of at least partial imperial restoration, and America likely to follow a more volatile policy, and the continued instability of the Middle East make it even more necessary not to neglect relations with our European partners. 9. However, the British people having decided that Britain's future must now lie outside the EU, it is incumbent on both sides to establish a new relationship that will allow both to pursue their respective internal agendas according to their own domestic imperatives, and to cooperate whenever desirable and possible. A new framework of coexistence and co-evolution then is necessary, within which Britain and the EU can identify complementary interests and develop strategies to secure them. 10. Attempts to establish this type of framework will have to operate at 3 separate and yet interlinked levels. 1. Traditional diplomatic channels should be adequate for settling ordinary trade and political matters. There is nevertheless a potential danger that the talks following notification under the arrangements of Article 50 of the Lisbon Treaty of Her Majesty's government's decision to begin the process of leaving the EU may put these channels under considerable strain. This, Secretary of State, will be no reflection of the professionalism of the diplomats, but will reflect the domestic political constraints on both sides. 2. It will be necessary to develop a comprehensive framework that eliminates any underlying tensions and allows for the development of complementary interests. The most convenient vehicle for this would be regular exchanges on European security and economic policy. The great strategic risk entailed in Britain leaving the EU lies in the fact that there is now no longer a stabilizing and mediating element between Germany and France. The moment that Berlin and Paris cannot agree on the necessary next steps forwards, the EU will break apart. 3. Beyond this, both sides will need to develop a strategic concept of some form of community. The greatest achievement of Western leaders after the Second World War was the creation of the notion and of the strategic identity of an Atlantic community. A strategic European concept is necessary now, not only in its own right, but will help to promote common security interests. A new European community would facilitate also the solution of potentially contentious issues in the forthcoming negotiations, such as A, the respective rights of UK and EU citizens residing abroad, B, a common approach to regulations for work permits, and C, the status, preferably exempt from visa requirements of students and those seeking education at either UK or EU institutions, and common regulations for the promotion of scientific projects and cooperation. 11, the future position of the UK and of Europe as a whole will be shaped to some considerable degree by how Her Majesty's government and the EU envision these. E.A. Crowe, 1st of February 2017. So far, my little fantasy. Is any of this likely to emerge? Well, I'm afraid there are good reasons for being pessimistic. In truth, the choice in June last year was not between remain and leave, but rather between half in and fully out. And this out is now taking shape, more precise shape. When Theresa May set out her 12 objectives for a Brexit deal, she prefaced her remarks with the words that, and I quote, "The British people voted for change. They voted to shape a brighter future for our country. They voted to leave the European Union and embrace the world." End of quote. Now, and I'm not meaning this as a criticism, but the plain logic of these words and the plain logic of the vote was for Britain to leave completely and to embrace a buccaneering policy in pursuit of external trade. This sort of neo-Elizabethan destiny also means to pursue a more ad hoc and transactional foreign policy. Already David Cameron pursued a much more mercantilist policy, prioritizing trade deals over strategic issues or questions of political order. The outcome of the referendum will accelerate these developments. Terminating membership of the largest and freest and most friction-free market for an uncertain, yet to be negotiated future means subordinating all other diplomatic priorities to the imperatives of trade. Theresa May's tergiversations last weekend are a foretaste of the sort of awkward compromises that we can expect to make from now on. It is likely to entail a scaling down of Britain's strategic interest in a stable order as such. Over time, the new Department of International Trade may well come to usurp the Foreign and Commonwealth Office's role, already much reduced over the past 5 decades or so. So much so that the FCO might end up as one of the dignified but largely useless parts of our political machinery, like the Duchy of Lancaster. Membership of the EU and the so-called special relationship with the United States were the twin axes around which British foreign policy revolved for the past nearly 50 years. The close defense and intelligence ties between Britain and the United States notwithstanding, that relationship was special only ever to us, to this country. Strong powers do not need special relationships. Only weak powers do. There was also a clear understanding in both countries that the weight of Britain's influence in Washington depended very much on her standing in Europe. As a result of the EU referendum, one of the two axes has now gone, or will shortly go, and Britain will be more dependent on the ties with the United States at a time when the American voters have elected as their president a man who seems to be opposed to most, if not all, the central propositions of British and, for that matter, American foreign policy. And for all the Prime Minister's free trade rhetoric about embracing the world and so on, even a trade deal with the protectionist Trump administration will be more difficult to secure. And any agreement will undoubtedly contain aspects generally unpalatable to British voters on the NHS, on agriculture and consumer protection. The Trump position on international organizations, from the EU and NATO to the United Nations, is markedly different from that of the British government. If the Prime Minister decides to hug the President close, as Bill Clinton advised Tony Blair when George W. Bush was elected as President, there is the danger that this might complicate Britain's exit negotiations with the 27 other European powers. Hugging him close is also not likely to tame him. His first 10 days or so in office should dispel that notion forthwith, though he may still implode, you never know. In the 1950s, Harold Macmillan cultivated the idea of a Britain playing Greeks to the Romans, an older empire offering sage advice to the emerging Imperium Americanum. There was always an element of self-deception in that notion. I was rather tickled when Alan talked about Enoch Powell, because I'm sure Enoch Powell would probably have agreed with that. And it's not very often that I find myself in agreement with Enoch Powell, I have to say. But now that wise, sage old counsellor seems to be confronted with a latter-day Caligula, already in his final megalomaniac phase, unwilling and perhaps unable to listen to advice. As for that other vital ingredient of a post-Brexit grand strategic approach, reform of education and skills training, the government's political energy, I fear, will be consumed entirely by the negotiations with the other 27 EU states, and little progress seems likely here. As I put together my notes, I remembered a comment from Lord Cromer, who argued that an effective foreign policy, guided by a clear strategic sense, should help to tackle what he called, and I quote, our two greatest national dangers, backwardness in education and unsound finance, by which I mean more specifically spending more money than we can afford. Now that was in 1903, and we do not seem to have made much progress on either of those 2 points. The post-Cold War period is coming to an end, and with it, the larger post-war era is drawing to a close. The order established in 1945 is fragmenting, and the process of its disintegration is accelerating. The Brexit vote and the election of Donald Trump are symptoms of this process of decay. They are not its causes, but both have the potential of letting history spin out of control. The older order has not yet collapsed, but international politics are in flux now. Global stability, and with that, Britain's success in forging a new post-Brexit policy, will depend on whether that process can be slowed and whether some of the older structures can be preserved. And as for Britain's final destiny, she may well find herself restored to the position of Elizabethan England, a country on the northwestern periphery of European politics, culturally vibrant, no doubt, but of marginal significance politically, dependent for its precarious prosperity on foreign trade, yet highly suspicious of foreign countries and internally deeply divided. A country of a little over 65 million trying to strike out on its own will have to live on its wits and rely on a good deal of that rarest of political commodities, good luck. Thank you.